Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour. My name is Ato Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. I will be the host of each episode. Each episode of Contours will address a pressing issue, theme, or concept in 21st century literary studies. In many of these episodes, I will be hosting a dialogue with an author or authors from the Cambridge University press list. Others will feature a panel of experts in the field, and I will introduce those episodes as well. We aim to provide an invigorating, accessible forum for critical debate and reflection to engage and help students, teachers, and general readers. Contours will range from medieval literature to the present day, from all areas of global literary studies in the northern and southern hemispheres. Each episode will be approximately an hour long and will be available on YouTube on our new Contours page on Cambridge Core. We are joined in today's episode by Professor Eric Falci, Professor of English at UC Berkeley, and author of The Value of Poetry. Sean Pryor, Associate Professor of English at the University of New South Wales and editor of the Cambridge Companion to the Poem. And Vickery, Professor of Writing and Literature at Deakin University and editor of the Cambridge Companion to Australian Poetry. And Keith Leonard, Professor of Literature at the American University in Washington, D.C., and editor of the forthcoming Cambridge History to African American Poetry. We will be discussing their books in today's episode. We hope you find this episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour, useful, enjoyable, and relevant, and more importantly, that you be encouraged to join us again in the next episode. So welcome, everyone. So I have an opening question, which is to invite you to say a little bit about your individual books, just pitching it to a general audience and sharing the interesting bits of it. Shall I start with Anne? Start with Anne.
Oh, thanks. So the Cambridge Companion to Australian Poetry covers poetries that are from the oldest living culture of over 60,000 years old. It covers some of the most emergent forms of poetry that has really sort of blossomed in Australia, such as prose poetry, the verse novel, newer forms, hybrid forms like poetic biography as well. It has individual author chapters, some on First Nations poets like Lionel Fogarty. It covers probably the worldwide known hoax on Ernmelly. And it covers the challenges around ongoing settler colonialism, issues of nation, and sort of communities that are sort of wanting to challenge and partake in some of those formations.
Wonderful. In fact, there's a quick line in your introduction about Australian poetry representing prodigious diversity. Prodigious diversity, I think, is by Bronwyn Lee. But the prodigious diversity is both a historical diversity in the diversity of cultures and representation. So that's what I took from the introduction. It sounds to me like a magnificent collection. Shall I move to Sean? Please tell us.
Thanks, Ato. The companion to the poem. It's an introduction to poetry on the one hand, which is an impossibly broad topic. But we take a series of key concepts and key themes. And really the project of the book is to think about what it means to encounter a single poem. So what sort of ideas do we bring to the reading of a poem or the hearing of a poem in performance or any other kind of encounter with a poem? Is it that what we want from that poem is for it to be singular, for it to be special, for it to be unlike any other poem? Is it, on the other hand, that what we want from that poem is for it to be a recognizable example of a genre? So it's about the idea of the poem, really. It's about the ideas that we bring to our encounters with individual poems, and then it's about the connections that individual poems have with other poems as well as with other art forms, song and the novel, music, and so on and so forth. So yeah.
I'm going to ask you a ridiculous question that I am sure you've encountered before. What is your favorite poem and why?
I know my favorite poem.
Favorite poem and why?
The answer that I normally give is John Donne's A Nocturnal upon St. Lucy's Day, which is a very beautiful poem, I think. But it is an impossible question because often it's the poem that I have read and been most enthused about most recently.
It depends on your mood, how much coffee you have taken, all that kind of stuff. Too much coffee will, give you a different view of poetry, that's for sure. But actually, Eric, please tell us about your book, The Value of Poetry.
Sure. Actually, when Ray first kind of approached me with the idea of writing a book called The Value of Poetry, I was, for reasons that everyone can imagine, very apprehensive. I mean, the presumption involved, as Sean says, the kind of the massive, for me to opine upon the value of poetry from all times and all places just seemed ridiculous. But I kind of thought the way I kind of worked my way towards it is if I thought I could make it, and I think this comes back to a point that Sean made, I thought if I could make it a book about the kind of value of reading poems, then I think that's something I could kind of get behind, and then that would let me say something about the kind of importance of poetry as a cultural form and about the vital importance of reading poetry. And what I wanted to do, I kind of made a decision really pretty early, was I wanted to kind of make the case using contemporary poetry. I mean, that is, I love Donne and Keats and Shakespeare, but I wanted to try to kind of focus on contemporary poems, particularly the kinds of poetry that might be far from the conventional expectations of what a poem might be. So I range pretty widely in the book. I mean, from, Jeremy Prynne and Seamus Heaney to M. Norbese Phillip and Natalie Harkin and Ed Roberson and Juliana Spar and Tracy Smith. And so just there's a lot, it's kind of a really kind of, I wouldn't call it a prodigious diversity, but it's a lot of poetry. And I kind of wanted to show in the book, what happens when we read poems slowly and intimately and skeptically, and about how that kind of encounter might be able to model, very loosely, very kind of homologously, a way of kind of being in the world and being with others in the world. And so that's what I was doing.
You do, in your intro, there's a phrase you used, I think it's a sentence that caught my attention. And you said, poetry makes language chimerical. Poetry is language chimerical. I thought that's such a great headline for the New York Times. Don't you think? Poetry makes language chimerical. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I guess, in a certain kind of, in a way that's both straightforward and kind of constantly exhilarating. poems use the stuff, the artistic material of poems is the stuff that we all use every day for all the stuff, human language, right? And so, unlike a music or visual art where, red doesn't have an agreed upon meaning, a B flat minor chord doesn't have an agreed upon meaning. Whereas, the words that we use for everyday life are also the same. It's the same material that we use for poems. And when we kind of pressurize that material in poems, however that pressurization takes place, however that kind of intensification takes place, the words take on a kind of double force, right? And that they are both the words that we have shared meanings to, right? And the way in which this particular kind of sonic shape artifact is kind of happening in a poem. I mean, it's sort of what makes Stein so intransigent all the time, is that she just like strips away that part of language in which language has shared meanings, and so that's kind of the chimerical quality of it, I think. And in certain ways this could go back to like Jacobson's The Poetic Function and the sound, focusing on the sound of the poem and the kind of inscriptive quality of of the sound of the word of the poem, rather than kind of just its kind of instrumental meaning in that sense. So I think that's sort of what I meant by that.
That's actually a wonderful description. And also what you mentioned just now, the sonic shape of the artifact, is that we should always imagine poetry being expressed rather than just inert on a page. Does that function in the sonic? Because you mentioned sonic, and immediately I see how different it is when a poem is read out. And I think one of you, I forget which one, that the reading may change depending on, so it's the same poem, but the artifact is altered when it is read out depending on context. And that's one of the beauties of it. Yeah. So Keith, tell us about your history of the Cambridge history of African American poetry.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to say that one of its great distinctions and one of the great pleasures of editing it is that it's the first of its kind. There's been a great deal of scholarship about African American poetry over the years, but this is the first time that leading scholars have been gathered together on one book to trace the evolution of African American poetry making from the era of enslavement into the contemporary times. And it's been part of what it's about is that transition from confronting ideas about not being human and making the value of a poem, your basic assertion that you belong in the human family, to the ways in which African Americans have reshaped the sonic structure of poems to articulate community, to validate a sense of ethnic heritage. And as we have seen with the incredible upsurge of African American poets winning major prizes like MacArthur Genius Grants and Pulitzer Prizes, that this trajectory of this tradition has come to shape US poetry very powerfully. And so it's been great to work with these leading scholars to develop a sense of that coherence and contention, the ways in which these poets are in conversation with one another and with American poetry, and have produced some really, really beautiful poems with some urgency about how they can change the way that we relate to one another in the world.
Of course, each of you has credited hymns and songs. It seems songs, as also bearing the poetic poetry or being poetic. But now I have a question which has been, in a way, it's been, bugging me a little bit. Bob Dylan, I'm so sorry. Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in 2016. And Kendrick Lamar was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2018. And this was a big wake-up call, I think, to the literary community. Can you talk us through, and this is, anyone can answer, what it is that makes, qualifies Bob Dylan's work to be considered poetry or literature to the point of winning the Nobel Prize? Same with Kendrick Lamar. What might a musician, choose any musician, Bob Marley is one of my favorites. In what ways might Bob Marley or any musician of your choice be actually delivering poetry?
Oh, I suppose it's the connection between lyric and music, and the sort of memorability, maybe, of the music, the song, that it stays with us. And I think that is also maybe something which the best poetry does, is that it moves us as well, so that there's something that is an embodied response to the lyricism of maybe Bob Dylan.
Mm-hmm.
May I?
Yes, of course, Eric. Oh, Leonard. Sorry, Keith. I didn't hear.
That's okay.
Yes, of course.
Just want to make sure I'm not interrupting anyone. One of the things that strikes me, I don't know Bob Dylan's music well. I know Kendrick Lamar's work a bit better, but it strikes me that part of what people love about both is that the chimerical part of it, the ways in which they use the language that we have and do it in ways that are both memorable but also distinctive and unique. And so if you listen to a Bob Dylan tune, part of what moves you about it, from what I understand from people who love his work, is that he's able to capture a sense and emotion beautifully, and using language both in recognizable but also not quite recognizable ways. And Kendrick Lamar definitely distinguishes himself in the creation of persona and creating different rhythmic structures to his rhymes, and so that it's not always the expected place of emphasis. There are shifts within individual songs, and so this testifies to a kind of creativity that I think people attribute to poetry, because it allows us into the mind of the author, or at least we get a sense, as that idea of the lyric overheard, we get a sense of being into someone else's mind, and that invitation comes through language reworked to be quite beautiful and distinctive, even as we recognize that it's speaking to us and for us.
The invitation into someone else's mind, which of course brings us to the lyric. But I'll defer the question about what the lyric does in a moment to a little bit later. Sean, what do you think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think what both Keith and Anne have said is right. I think on the one hand, there is obviously a strong historical connection between poetry and song. Or even it might be said that in certain cultures, the distinction doesn't obtain, or at certain points in history, the distinction doesn't obtain. So I think we could historicize the categories, so to speak. We could think about what we mean by poetry, what we mean by song, and how we differentiate those concepts. So the origins of lyric poetry in music would be a good way to do that. But so too would be thinking about, say, generally accepted common characteristics of each art form. So, and the example of hip hop of Kendrick is a good one, because one way in which the argument is made for hip hop as poetry is to point to the fact that it rhymes, which makes perfectly good sense because we associate rhyme with poetry. On the other hand, a good deal of contemporary print-based poetry doesn't rhyme. So there are, if you like, not quite competing but distinct concepts of poetry in operation today, as well as across history. It's an interesting problem, I would say, rather than a problem one can solve.
Yeah. Your keyword, the keyword that you use in your introduction, the encounter, they're different, because the encounter implies a number of things. It implies the poet or the poetic persona, the reader or the addressee, and then all that can be shaped by the artifact itself. So the encounter, but the shaping of the encounter varies historically. So Kendrick Lamar, Bob Marley, all these have shaped that encounter. in different ways. But the shaping is also memorable. It's an invitation into their minds, their creative processes. I think your key word, encounter, is open to more elaboration. Definitely. Now I wanted to ask, and this is also my own curiosity. So the lyric as a mode of reflection of the inside, so internal state, reflecting upon an unfolding world. So it's soul and world, but that reflection is poetic. It's concerned with the chimerical features of language. It may also be communal. So it's an individual, but also communal. In many of the cases or the chapters in Anne's Companion to Australian Poetry speak to the communal nature of the poetry. There's a kind of nation and narration mode, but nation is both capital N, which is Australia, and small n. So what's about the lyric and this unfolding reflection of the I? Basically, I'm inviting you to say anything you want about the lyric. Yeah. What about Eric?
I mean, maybe one way to think about it is to kind of go back a bit to the previous question about music, about song lyrics and poetry lyric. In some sense, like as Sean says, it's almost, I mean, we're just back to Sappho, right, with Bob Dylan, in the sense that for long periods of history, what poetry meant was more public than Wordsworth thinking about his own sense of being Wordsworth in a space, and so that it was about public performance. It was the expectation was that the speaker of the composer of the poem would also be the speaker of the poem, and that speaker of the poem, the performer of the poem, reciter of the poem, would also be accompanying themselves in some sort of musical fashion. And so, for a long periods of history and all throughout, that's as common as our kind of more modern, our kind of contemporary or modern, say post-romantic, although it goes before that, because notion of the lyric as a kind of mode of self-reflection, of self-production, of self encounter with the world. And I think it goes back out into that. One way to think about it is that lyrics often kind of like maligned for being this kind of monologic, hubristic, self-centered kind of thing, and I don't know, lots of poems are, but I think that sense of kind of what you call the communal or the collective, right? And I was thinking during the music question, I was thinking about someone like Linton Kwesi Johnson, who if we think about three sites of kind of encounter for his poetry, in live performance with like the dub poetry and the sound system and an audience in a particular place in Brixton in 1970, whatever, with particular political stakes surrounding the poetry, I mean, versus the very popular albums in the 70s and early 80s versus that wasn't part of my formative period, but like then what happens when you encounter Linton Kwesi Johnson as a kind of Penguin classic poet in a text, right? And so it's like all of those things are lyric poems in a sense, but they ask for radically different modes of kind of reception that are politically charged, I think, in different ways, right? Like I wouldn't call Linton Kwesi Johnson's poetry Wordsworthian in its kind of intense self-reflection all the time, but it does produce that form of lyric, if not self-reflection, then kind of outward reflection. I think that I think it's another important thing that lyric poetry does, and often doesn't really get talked about as much because,
So Keith, African American, the vast African American poetic tradition. Does the lyrics? So yours is a two-pronged question. First is how does the lyric feature in African American poetry? Obviously, it does, but more importantly, does the form of the lyric, and by form I mean the processual unfoldment of the poetic personas view or responses to the world. Does that instigate a response in the reader or the listener? Because much of this poetry is about this world of ours. It's not just Wordsworthian you mentioned. I think Wordsworth was doing some poems that are this world of ours kind of poem. So that's the question. First of all, how does it feature in African American poetry, and does that in any way also instigate a process of reflection on the part of reader, listener, and so on?
Thank you for that question. It's really very provocative. The first thing that comes to mind is that the urgency of the lyric for writers in the early part of the tradition, someone like a Phyllis Wheatley, who was an enslaved poet, whose claim to fame was the very fact that she could write, that abolitionists were saying to the slaveholders, these people are people. And so proving the very fact of your imagination means that there's a real urgency in being able to reflect your internal workings as valid, and in her case, supported by genuine Christian spirituality. But it's notable that most of her famous poems are, in fact, occasional poems, elegies. The people who claimed to own her would be invited to have their poet write about on the occasion of someone's death, and they'd be published in local newspapers and what have you. So the interaction between the public and the personal in her lyrics is very much about this kind of powerful tension. It also reminded me of the poem Yet Do I Marvel by County Cullen, which gets a lot of attention in a couple of different essays in the Cambridge History of African American Poetry because of that famous line with which the sonnet ends. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. If you read that poem, you know that Cullen compares the very fact of being black and trying to be a poet. He compares that to the punishments of Tantalus and Sisyphus, and opens the poem wondering why God would treat them so badly and also create this similar kind of conundrum. It is worth noting that it is a perfectly executed Shakespearean sonnet. So even as he's lamenting this anxiety and this pressure of being black and all of the expectations that comes with it, he's also saying, look what I can do with it. And part of what that is inviting the reader to see is that even though the tension between race and poetry is a kind of conundrum, it is a beautiful, productive conundrum. And if I may add one last thought, I don't mean to go on too long, but it is worth that thinking about that public idea of the lyric because of how important the jazz blues tradition has been to African American poetry. The idea that many poets like Langston Hughes sought to embody what the blues singer did, which is that their I was often both very much a particular I, personal to themselves, and an I assuming that their listener would have a similar kind of experience. So when Bessie Smith sings about the backwater blues, the 1927 Mississippi flood, she knows that others in her audience have had similar experiences of their houses washed away. And so that stance of the blues makes the lyric, again, both personal and public at the same time. And I think that has sometimes been read by critics of African American poetry as a diminishment of its beauty, but I think now we recognize that it's actually been an amplification and of the kind of multiple ways in which that unfolding can function.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer. Which brings me to another question, which is the sources of inspiration for poetry. We have religiously inspired poetry, religiously inspired hymns, and so on. But we also have Sufi poetry, which is religious but different. It's also a lyric in a sense, but very religious. Could you speak to, and I'm starting with Anne, could you speak to the various sources? And by sources, I just mean the inspiration. What is the kind of trigger? What are some of the triggers that makes a poet feel that they will choke to death if they don't write? What are some of in the Australian tradition? What have been some of the sources of inspiration?
I do think actually for some of the First Nations writers, it's actually trying to go back and trace their family and to go back into the archive and try and find sort of traces of family history, and to find a intergenerational connection, and to write back to that, and to reinforce a sort of living language, I think is really important. And again, there's some of the urgency that Keith talks to. That's quite evident in writers like Natalie Harkin, for instance. I think some of the writers that are associated with the Bush School have this sort of mythographic call of trying to pull together this idea of a cohesive nation, and to imagine something which is distinctively Australian, as opposed to European, that can be shared, a mythography that can be shared. So I think that's another element. And again, I think there's writers who then feel that mythography doesn't speak for them, it doesn't include them. And so the urgency is to say, hang on, there's problems with that earlier poetry in who is the we, who is the us that is being spoken for. That's not me. And to write against that, and to offer alternatives of voice and community.
No, I love the mythographic inspiration and the way you put it, but of course it brings to mind the African literary tradition and African poetic tradition, which is, there's a lot of mythographic inspiration. Someone like Wole Soyinka, who also won the Nobel Prize. And it's clear he's inspired by the Yoruba traditions. But what about other sources of inspiration, Sean? Not necessarily just mythographic. What about other sources of inspiration for some of them? Yeah.
I wonder if this is not the answer you're after, Ato, but the answer that occurred to me when you first asked was that for all the variety of themes, so to speak, that poetry takes, one of its principal inspirations often is previous poetry, as Anne has been saying, or as Keith pointed out so well in thinking about Cullen writing a Shakespearean sonnet, and that engagement of a new poem with an older poem can take any number of forms. It can be a matter of being inspired to participate in a tradition. It can alternatively be a matter of being inspired to resist that tradition or to critique it, or merely to use that a precursor as a springboard for invention or experiment or whatever it might be. Yeah, that was the answer that occurred to me. I don't know
actually,
how helpful it is.
that's a beautiful answer, because of the students who, and they are now, writing is a big, so writing programs, creative writing programs are very big. In fact, many universities, at least in the United States, departments of English have devised ways of attracting students through creative writing aspect, and it saved many English departments. However, one of the things that I tell the students that come to, I'm a writer, I want to write, is a form, not as poetically put as Sean, you put it, is that first go and read poetry before you try to write it, and read lots of it, about 700 years of poetry, encounter about 700 years of it, then maybe you'll be able to write it. This is not the kind of prompt that is most liked, but I completely agree with you that one of the major triggers is a response to other poetry or other poetry forms, either to replicate, and it's also a form of apprenticeship. So they apprenticed themselves to the earlier forms, and then they devise ways of abandoning or critiquing and so on. And so I like it. I like that answer. But how about Eric? What other? So we have mythographic, we have earlier versions of poetic form. What do you think about this question of inspiration, sources of inspiration?
Well, I mean, like John, I might turn the answer in a way that I mean, I think, like, you know, there are so many ways in which a person who decides to write a poem, what's backing that, what's urging that on. I mean, I think one of the things to think about is that the sense in all of those kind of cases, whether it's a kind of about an attempt to, an almost kind of epic attempt to construct like a kind of myth, you know, a history and a myth for a particular culture community, or whether it's an attempt to kind of, you know, in a kind of, you know, we don't need to talk about T.S. Eliot or Harold Bloom, but to talk about the ways in which poets are writing poems in which that take their place among a whole history of poems. And I think behind all this is the sense that poetry provides a particular way into these kinds of problems, matters, topics, ways of being that other genres don't, right? I mean, I think, you know, I mean, you know, I think that, you know, so many poets, and Anne kind of started to talk about this, and Keith in a way too, are writing, you know, documentary, archival, historical poetics, poems now, poetry now. You know, and some of it takes, you know, highly inventive, kind of brilliant pyrotechnical form, like Tyemba Jess's Olio, right? Others is much more kind of open formed, but all of it seems to be premised upon the idea that poetry offers a way into these problems that other genres, forms, modes don't. And so that seems as, and then it's about that kind of thing that I think you mentioned, that you kind of alluded to, like the last thing that a creative writing undergraduate wants to be told is, well, before you try to write your sonnet, go read 400 of them. The sense of kind of like the freedom of you know, what we might call expression, and the kind of generative constraints of form, right? Like, it's always funny when students, you know, you give them a particular set of very strange constraints for a poem. You know, it can only be X number of lines. It has to do this and that, you know, very, very kind of almost kind of arbitrary constraints. And they end up producing kind of remarkable things because like they had something other than their own like instinct to help them along. But I do think it's the sense that poems offer, you know, particular ways into these much larger questions about belief, history, you know, questions around, I mean, poetry offers a particular way of thinking about kind of the impossible temporality of climate change that I think novels, not that they are lesser or something, but they offer something else, right? And so I think that's one way to understand poetry.
Well, on climate change, one of the big differences, at least in African literature, is the difference between landscape and land, or the representations of, because land is different from landscape. Landscape is picturesque, you know, there are all kinds of things that happen with regard to the depiction of landscape as opposed to land, which is an economic entity. It calls for particular kinds of responses of ownership or disavowal, whatever. Now, I've often wondered whether this dichotomy, or it maybe it's a dyad rather than opposition, how it has featured in Australian, and this is specifically my sense of what has happened in Australian poetry because of the vast arrays of land. But not only that the land was already occupied by Aboriginal entities. So what does this division between land and landscape work for understanding Australian poetry?
Yeah, thanks, Ato. I think there is a distinction between European understandings of land and First Nations understandings of country, and the relationship of self to land, and the sort of dynamics between it, so that that involves aspects of temporality. First Nations understandings of country is that you're part of something much bigger. It's a living concept that is cross-generational. And so there are huge distinctions between settler understandings of land, often associated with property and possession. I think also within Australian poetry, what we're seeing, given that we see the extremes of climate change, is that the poem is only one part of a larger set of actions and practices that can be put into place. And so there's a number of poets who are trying to connect poetry within those other practices to make it more transformative and to rethink its impact. And I think that's a really interesting move that's been occurring in Australian poetry that kind of puts sort of new areas like eco-poetics under pressure.
Thank you. So Keith, on African American poetry, I want to invite you to talk about not just eco-poetics, but some of the to put it in a way, it's just a provocation, how newness enters the world. How does newness enter the world? And how is this newness dealt with in African American poetry? So you can take it in any direction, eco-poetics, gender, whatever, but how does newness, including political violence, because political violence is both old and new, how does African American poetry reflect on the ways in which newness enters the world?
It's a powerful question. One of the thoughts that comes to mind is that the trying to articulate a new sense of some of these old ideas about liberal humanism from a position of being excluded. So part of how newness enters the world is to engage and contest with that which has come before. And so if you're a Cullen and you want to articulate your sense of your own poetic newness, you do so almost paradoxically through Shakespeare. Another thought that comes to mind about how newness enters the world is to, after you have done all that reading and found the place where you don't fit, you try to find a form that can fit, that in which you feel more like you fit. And so M. Nobercy Phillip is an example of this. I've read all of the Nzong. She reads some of the court cases that talked about how Africans thrown overboard can be insured or not. And she uses that found language to create phrases, words, and even orders of letters to try to create voices for those people thrown overboard. So that newness is, there's no form for this. I've tried to find forms for this in all of these other ways. So I now need to invent a new form to try to capture something that this language has not made available. So those are ways in which it occurs to me that newness might enter the world for the African American poetic tradition.
Sean, more generally, how does poetry reflect upon and reflect on how newness enters the world?
Yeah, that is a big question. Well, what occurs to me is to think about the ways in which different kinds of poetry themselves come into the world. So one way to think about it would be to consider an ephemeral form of poetry, maybe, for instance, performance poetry, which is of the moment. And so the coming into the world of newness in the case of a poetry like that, which may never be recorded, it may never be written down, but will exist in that moment for those people there at that time, is a kind of radical newness in a sense. Alternatively, you could think of the poem as object, like a printed poem, for instance, as bringing something new into the world that remains, right? As a record of the bringing of something new into the world. That's distinct from either of those two kinds of poetry as a reflection on newness. That's a separate question, but generically or formally, you could think of the poetry itself as the newness
in itself.
Yeah.
So another, provocative question, which has no particular answer, is politics antithetical to poetry? In the sense that, and it's a larger question which implicates the novel and other forms of literature. That is to say, to be overly message laden is to destroy the artistic expression. Is politics antithetical to poetry? Each of you, take it in any direction. Let me start with Eric.
I mean, yeah, I guess the way I'd start to answer that question is by split politics into two things, right? Which is, is there a form of poetry that isn't political in the largest sense? No, right? Even the most kind of, I mean, this we don't need to go into Adorno, but like, the poet or poem that imagines itself to be separate from, free from society or politics or culture is absolutely steeped in those things. Even the thought that it's separate is itself a political thought in that sense. And so I think in that largest sense, poems are kind of, politics is baked in, right? Even, and to go back to what, something that Keith was saying, the politics of lyric are also the politics of a certain kind of liberal humanism. And so, at least kind of post-romantic lyric. And so politics are always there. I guess the other part of the question, is, where is the insistence of a particular political message? Does that, I don't know,
invalidate,
hinder the poem? And I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess, like, I don't know, I'm thinking, there's a lot of poems that have that, their politics are pretty right out there. Like, I like to go back to another, to go back to Lytton Kwesi Johnson, to go back to Adrienne Rich, Denise Ridley, where a certain set of politics is there. It's not propaganda, but a certain set of politics is there, and they're still great poems, because the political topic isn't just a kind of slogan, but it's a problem to think through over the course of the poem, I'd say. I mean, so Rich's poems are deeply political in the kind of, I think, in the way that you kind of were thinking about, but they're not less poemy because of that, I'd say. But yeah,
they still obey or invoke the chimerical character of language. So they may be political, but the chimerical, they are true to that principle, the chimerical character of language. Anne, what do you think about this politics? Because I'm sure it rages in different contexts. Oh, this is not poetry, it's propaganda or poet. Yes, how does this debate play out in Australian poetry?
I mean, I think that chimerical element, definitely, that there's something in addition that sort of distinguishes poetry. At the same time, I was actually thinking of some sound poetry, which is just kind of playing around with sound. Again, how much that's political, I would say is debatable. So I think that there's such a wide spectrum of poetry that we can consider. And, again, in terms of maybe visual poetry, again, what that's doing, of even moving beyond the word and, looking at aspects of page I think is really maybe looking at received, questioning received notions of, what even is the parameters of poetry. So that there's a range of political questions that might apply, but maybe it's also something else. We haven't really talked about that, even just enjoyment of poetry, that the pleasure that we get from poetry, and that might be visual, that might be sound. So I think that needs to be thrown into the mix as well.
Sean, what do you think of this ridiculous question?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It seems to me it's a good prompt for thinking about the difference between categorization and judgment. So it was interesting that Eric said these poems are political, but they're still great poems. So I think the sense is often that for a poem to be didactic or to be propaganda is to be poorer as a poem, is to be less valuable as a poem. Now that depends upon a certain desire for poetry, a certain idea of poetry and what poetry ought to do. It's definitely the case that poetry over its long history has been political. So in terms of categorization, it's unambiguously the case that poetry can be political. The question is whether that makes for good poetry, and that depends upon your criteria for judgment, your assumptions about what poetry ought to do or should be. Yeah, I think that would be my suggestion anyway.
Yeah, question of judgment, obviously. Keith, because this will be a big question for African American poetry.
So the tiny little corner that I'll bite off right now is that that question has a particular fraughtness, because for African American poets in the United States, writing about being Black has been considered by definition political by certain critics of a certain taste. So I'm reminded of a critic named Lewis Simpson who said something like, it's probably impossible for a Black poet to write without letting us know that they're Black. But if being Black is the only subject, then the writing is not important. And so if, we take seriously that truism or that aphorism about write what you know, then writing about your Black self has been imposed upon as a political act. And so navigating any kind of desire for thinking about what the beautiful is in poetry from the perspective of a Black person writing about, as Gwendolyn Brooks did, her neighborhood in the South Side of Chicago, the Black people who walked up and down the street and listened to blues and what have you, that becomes the idea that you can just talk about yourself and that might be read as political is really complicating. And so I think part of what I really appreciated Anne's reminder about pleasure. I think part of how some poets, Brooks is one, Langston Hughes is another, Rita Dove too, I think, remind us about the pleasures of thinking about the specifics of your life, and that part of that pleasure makes its way into the word choice to try to capture what that feeling or that experience might be. And so making a poem sound like the blues, or adopting the language of your neighbors, that Black vernacular language, the pleasure they take in playing the dozens on the street and turning that into a kind of poetic form, takes a certain kind of politics and makes it beautiful. And I think that pleasure part of it is an interesting answer to this question, or an interesting component to an answer to this question.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We have run this is a magnificent conversation. I wish there were another forum where we would have a large audience. But thank you very much. Any final thoughts or final words on poems, poetry, poets, the world in which we live, and so on and so forth? Any final thoughts? No?
Whenever I think about the questions, when people ask questions about, does poetry matter? What is the value of poetry? Is all those articles about poetry being dead? I tend to answer that question in part by saying, I'm not sure about literary poetry, with all of the ways in which it's not necessarily kind of a great way to earn a living, but poetry will continue to live. Little kids will continue to play with language. people will still go to church and hear hymns or read their Dr. Seuss books well into their adulthood or their Shel Silverstein or what have you. And so that impulse, those inspirations to articulate yourself through the chimerical work of language, that is always there. And I think for me, it's been important to remind myself of that every day as I walk into a classroom, as it feels like aspects of the world are burning down around me. Why am I doing this? I'm doing this because it matters. It is very much an assertion of some of the most beautiful parts of what we are as human beings. And so I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to talk about poetry with you all today.
Very well said.
Yes.
Yeah, what Keith said.
Said yes. So thank you all so much. It's been a magnificent conversation. I've had so much fun. But thank you. And also, as I said in my email, we are discussing things that we well and truly love.
Yes.
In this case,
Absolutely.
poetry. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.